Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is going to be Lecture 2, Explaining Ethnicity, and this is by Henry Hale. It's a very famous piece in ethnic conflict literature, or ethnicity literature in general. Um, One other thing I wanted to say, please remember on the papers that I run them through an AI checker, actually multiple AI checkers. Please don't try to plagiarize or use AI to generate your paper. It's one of the only ways that people fail my courses. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Please do your own work. It is important not only today, but it is important to build the skills necessary for law school, graduate school, higher level organizational employment, right? So put in the time and put in the work. All right. That's all I'll say about that. Okay. Section one, we'll talk about the introduction, right? There are many conceptualizations of ethnicity going all the way back to arguably the 19th century, the 18th century, even. Um, so, one is just this sort of emotion laden sense of belonging or attachment to a particular kind of group, right? And this is from Horowitz, most famously. If anyone has a chance to read Horowitz's Ethnicity book from 1985, please do. It is a phenomenal piece of work. You will have to read it, guaranteed, if you go to graduate school. But it's like 1,000 pages long, right? And so I couldn't really assign it. But it is a phenomenal book. It's one of my very favorite books in this subject. And this subject was my dissertation. So I absolutely love Horowitz's book. There's some really great stuff in there. There's some wrong stuff in there. Don't get me wrong. That's how science works. But phenomenal, really, really well researched book. Okay. The second is this idea of embeddedness in a web of significant symbols, right? And this is most famously sort of propagated by Smith in 2000. He had a really famous piece. Excuse me. The third is a social construct or a choice to be made, right? So the first two are very sort of primordialist. The second is very much constructivist, right? It says construct in the definition. Um, the fourth is Brubaker says, this is a cognitive process. So again, it's sort of a construct rather than a primordial thing that you're born with. Vandenberg does some really interesting stuff with genetic research, actually, and sort of evolutionary biology, right? And says that there is this, if we think about meerkats, even, right? Meerkats sort of group together in particularized groups. They are much more likely to call out things like warnings for the closer you are biologically related, right? So if you have a twin, you're much more likely to help protect them or call out a warning, which brings predation upon yourself. If you have a twin versus a brother versus a cousin versus a second cousin, right? So there are actually behavioral patterns to your genetic relatedness to other animals in your group, right? It's remarkable findings, and we find this across many different animals, right? And of course, it's not conscious; it's subconscious, but somehow subconsciously, animals tend to know their level of relatedness, genetic relatedness to another creature, right? In their group. And so, based on this sort of evolutionary theorizing, Vandenberg says that ethnicity sort of plays out in this way, right? In that we have these biological survival instincts, and because of sort of the networking effects, in-group effects, etc., we base our survival instincts in the group based on nepotism, right? And we're more likely to give out goods, benefits, services, etc., to those very closely related to us. and then a little bit less to those less closely related to us, and then even less to those who are sort of in our ethnic group relative to outsiders, right? So very, very interesting research. And then finally, Fearon and Leighton, who are very, very famous sort of ethnic conflict and also just conflict scholars, and I think they're at NYU and Yale, if I remember correctly, at least back when I was in grad school. Anyway, so they try to build this really cool econometric model that sort of mixes a lot of the above, right? But the big point here is that there are a lot of different ways to look at ethnicity, and there are two main, at least academic categories, primordialism and constructivism, through which we view ethnicity, right? And so, yeah, so Hale says we need to try and figure out a way to, you know, maybe consolidate some of this stuff and make it a little more simple. And then maybe even like mix the two together for a sort of quote unquote unified field of ethnic conflict. Okay, section two, theories of groups and groups of theories. So we should talk about primordialism and constructivism. We touched on them lightly in the former lecture. Um, But like we talked about, primordialism is basically this idea that ethnicity and ethnic membership are innate, right? Quote, each group has its particular constitutive features, such as cultures, traditions, histories, physical traits, language repertoires, religion, and etc., that also do not change and that tend to be quite consistently distributed within the group, right? So everyone has these traits. They tend to be sort of the same across group members that tie group members together historically, genetically, culturally, etc. On the other side, we have constructivism, right? And many constructivists argue, quote, modernization or even concrete state policies play a large role in forming groups where no group consciousness existed before. And what we know about this is if you look at Africa pre colonialism, there were few quote unquote ethnic groups, right? There were tribes, there were cultures, there were but they didn't really see themselves through an ethnic lens, right? The sort of what would you call them artificial boundaries created by not only geographic literal boundaries but also sort of social boundaries, educational boundaries, labor boundaries, all of these things created by the colonists, right? Denmark, Britain, the US, Germany, Portugal, whatever, sort of created these artificial ethnic groups and differences, right? Um, so it's pretty interesting, and there's evidence on both sides, right? Like there is anthropological and historical evidence for ethnic grouping, but then there's also anthropological historical evidence, mm, at least in modernity, that suggests that ethnic groups can just be sort of created from thin air. So you know, it's really interesting to look through this literature and see sort of arguments for both sides, right? And real world case study examples for both sides. Okay. Constructivists also say, quote, identities never become locked in and that people are always at least somewhat free to change them, subject to certain constraints such as costs, skills, physical endowments, etc. This latter view sees great scope for the elite manipulation of popular ethnic identities, manipulation these authors tend to see as a key causal factor in ethnic politics, right? And so the idea here is that the elites in society tend to sort of whip up ethnic fervor where might be um, it might be less front of mind for people generally, or even less maybe ethnicity is sort of barely a way we think about each other, but the idea here is that politicians or economic elites, etc., will push this vision of society of ethnicity so as to garner votes, things of this sort, right? Okay, so despite these disagreements between sort of primordialists and constructivists, what do we agree on, right? Which is an important question. And they say, quote, real world primordialists and constructivists agree that identities are constructed, right? That beliefs about primordiality are formed during some identifiable period in history, that their symbolic content can vary to some degree over time, and that there is at least some variation in the intensity or nature of group ID across members, right? And so some members will feel more Tutsi than others, right? Some members will feel more Tamil than others, right? Um, some will identify heavily as Sikh, whereas others will not necessarily. And that, like, there are contextual situations in which you feel more or less heavily involved in or identified with an ethnic group, right? Um, Further, many constructivists concur with primordialists that group identities tend to be pretty stable once created, right? So it's not like you're willy nilly just jumping from ethnic group to another. Like this does happen, don't get me wrong. But it tends to be very contextualized. It tends to be pretty difficult, right? Um, and so the most striking divide between seems to be first those who contend that individuals can change identities easily, even once identities appear sort of crystallized in society, right? So there are arguments about like how easy is it to sort of walk away from your ethnic identity and into another one, right? And B, like it's on a spectrum, right? From very difficult on the primordialist side to pretty easy depending on the context on the constructivist side, right? And then B, those who argue that this is, for most practical intents and purposes, impossible because people think about ethnicity in primordial terms, right? So there is still that divide about some people who say, no, you just flat out cannot change your ethnicity. I tend to find fall much more on the constructivist side than the primordialist side. Okay, so Henry Hale says that if we look at all that we've just read and discussed, these distinctions sort of suggest new categories should be built, right? Rather than primordialists versus constructivists, we should have instrumentalists versus perdurabilists, which is a weird word, right? Excuse me. So the instrumentalists basically say that, this refers to the possibility of instrumentally altering your individual ethnic identity within particular constraints within society, right? So you can actually sort of lean into one ethnicity or another, depending on, say, the political benefits that come to one group or another. The benefits that come to you from, say, the the market benefits of being in a particular ethnic group or another. These sorts of things, right? And then there are the perdurabilists. God, it's a hard word to really get out of your mouth, even. Who sort of suggest that individual level ethnic identities are far more durable once they're constructed, right? And then finally, he points out in this section that the main point of this whole article is that there is a severe paucity of research on sort of the psychological causes of ethnicity, right? Like we know a lot about ethnicity, group membership, the benefits of ethnicity, the sort of market and social benefits of belonging to a group, all of these sorts of things. What we don't really know is what are the psychological reasons for investing in an identity, right, through an ethnic lens. So Section 3 opens up with identity as, quote, social radar, right? Really interesting idea here. And he said, identity basically is a perceptual device through which people come to see where they stand in relation to their human environment, their culture, their fellow mankind in their city or region or whatever it might be. He says, in the most basic sense, then, groups are defined by common relationships to points of social reference. So ethnicity is about social referencing. It is about sort of placing yourself and having these informational cues that come with being a member of a group, sort of reducing uncertainty about your world. And so the theoretical and psychological underpinnings for this theory come from first Mead in 1934. So a lot of this stuff he says is about uncertainty reduction. We know that humans like to take shortcuts mentally to reduce uncertainty. These tend to be called heuristics, and they are just sort of informational shortcuts. This can include things like, I don't know, stereotypes. It can include things like language cues, the cues that things like clothing send, all of these sorts of things. And so Mead in 1934, to sort of start all this off, it starts with sort of Mead and Freud. Mead argues that the concept of the self, right, is driven by how others see you, right? And so we'll just start from that very simple assumption. And then if you move on to Freud, a very famous sort of ethnicity scholar named Erickson did some work on Freud's psychological ideas about ethnicity. And he says, Freud's ideas are about the id, but of course the id does not have free reign, right? And the id is mediated by the ego and the superego, as long as you have a healthy brain, which tend to mediate relations with the outside world. And so the ego and the superego would be sort of what attaches to ethnicity to get this informational shortcut and to reduce uncertainty about the world, right? And let's see, finally, social psychology and sort of evolutionary psychology suggest that uncertainty reduction is a fundamental human motivator, which drives the nearly universal tendency for humans to divide themselves into groups, right? And so uncertainty reduction is furthered by identity with a group. We also have some sort of experimental and analytical results, right? So, Tajfel, which is a very, very famous ethnicity scholar, I've read a lot of their work. Tajfel sort of purports the social identity theory in 1982. And he's trying to, through experimental design, discover sort of a minimum human grouping context, right? So, like, at what level do we get grouping, and what is the sort of the minimal threshold for the number of people involved? And the research says that people begin to behave in a group manner, favoring their own group, their in group, right? Primarily when there is some notion of having a common fate with other group members, of finding firmly in line with the notion that groups involve common reference points to the social world, right? And so these groups are just sort of intellectual shortcuts for how to find your way through the world. And he says that simply telling people that they belong to a particular group was enough to produce group oriented, in group, out group behavior, right? Really interesting stuff. And that not only did he find them sort of in the lab, the college, right, but that we have found these to be replicated across cultures across the planet, right? Thousands of studies about social identity theory have been run and have found that these things happen in every culture, basically, right? Across ages, across classes, across linguistic groups, all kinds of different. I mean, they've even gone to like these little tribes that basically have never met humans before and run these kind of experiments and found the same exact results. So they're very, very strong results. So we move on to Hogg and Mullen, who in 1999 find that uncertainty reduction tends to sort of supersede Tajfeld's core theory of self-esteem, right? And so a lot of the Tajfeld theory was built around the idea that group identity and group consciousness and group membership, etc., are based on bolstering self-esteem. But Hogg and Mullen and other economists, through their experimentation, said, well, yes, that's part of it, but it's more about uncertainty reduction, right? It's more about heuristics that tell us about what the likely outcome of a social interaction is going to be. One crucial implication is that identity itself changes as a person's environment changes, because environmental change forces a reevaluation of the person's relationship to that environment, at least on a minimal and probably subconscious level. Moreover, because identity depends directly on the state of the social world around you, we see that identity cannot be a stable state of mind, but is instead inherently dynamic or perpetually in the making, right? And they're not saying we're going to see giant leaps in people's identity, right? But they're saying we're always making sort of tinkering at the margins of what our identity, how we see ourselves, and how we see ourselves in relation to the world around us are constantly being updated, right, through this sort of almost Bayesian statistical process. They also say the most acutely felt change tends to occur during adolescence, right? This is where we sort of build our concept of self identity and group membership because the way the environment affects people changes dramatically during your adolescence. Nevertheless, Erickson stresses that identity is never, quote, formed even after adolescence, but that it is a lifelong development, right? Identity, though it can and does change, is relatively stable, like we were talking about earlier. Many of the reference points that are most important to people are likely to remain quite stable, such as family relationships, national citizenship, gender, language repertoire, and place of residence, right? Okay. Section 4, the thickening of identity uh, dimensions, right? So this is about how thin or thick is your feeling of identity, right? These aren't just this sort of each feeling of identity is equivalent. So we need to understand that it's sort of a spectrum. And he starts with Gertz's 1973 idea of thickness of membership, right? This comes from Gertz. And Gertz says personal points of reference or categorizations become thicker when they come to have greater importance in people's lives, right? So it's contextual. When people's lives are affected in more ways by the reference. And he says there are, across the literature, different sort of theorized thickeners of identity, right? The first would be opportunities and limitations. So we have intrinsically important distinctions like language. We have the distinctions that are imposed upon people, like allocation of resources. Right, this is a big fight in America right now. Again, whether you could see American politics and sort of racial definitions as ethnicity is questionable. But we do see sort of a fight about resource allocation depending on racial groups, right? Sort of the new Trump administration and their DEI policies, migration, all of these sorts of things tie in, right? And Trump is famous for using sort of in-group, out-group language and behavior to whip up the fervor of voters, as we've sort of talked about in this unit, right? So you can sort of see a real-world example, And America isn't nearly even like the worst of this, right? It gets much, much worse in some places. Let's see. We also know through research and experimentation that sort of conflict or distress or whatever you might want to call it tends to thicken ethnic ties, right? So if there is literal conflict, or if there are sort of downturns in economics, things like this, recessions, depressions, then your sort of your bond to your ethnic group tends to thicken, right? So you get more group cohesion, you tend to get more in-group favoritism, you get greater levels of distrust in others. Um, you get a much higher willingness to accept centralized leadership, right? Which is perhaps theorized to be one of the reasons that we're seeing a rise in dictatorial states across the world. Um, and you tend to get an emphasis on winning elections rather than on actually considering the merits of particular issues, which again we are seeing across the world rising, including in the US. And you tend to get reductions in intergroup communication, right, as people sort of rally around themselves. Excuse me. And he says, we should see these sort of points of personal reference as rules of thumb. And they call it rules of thumb here, but across the literature, they're generally known as what's called a heuristic, right? An informational shortcut. Heuristic, Heuristic. Kind of a funky word, but it just means a shortcut of information, a mental shortcut, whatever you might want to call it. And so he basically says that, if you combine this idea of uncertainty reduction with the obvious and scientifically backed cognitive limitations of the human mind and the limitations that imperfect information creates, then it makes sense often contextually to thicken your your in-group perceptions, right? To feel more ethnically aligned than some other identity of self, right? Like class or gender or, American or whatever it might be, right? Okay. Section 5, ethnic identity. So we finally sort of get to a definition of ethnicity. And he says ethnic identity or ethnicity is that set of personal points of reference, thick and thin, that involve what we call ethnic distinctions between people. An ethnic group is thus a set of people who have common points of reference to these ethnic dimensions of the social world and who perceive that they indeed have these things in common and that these similarities are captured by a label, the ethnic group's name. By ethnic, most follow Weber in referring mainly to such points of personal reference as, quote, perception of common descent, history, faith, culture, which usually indicates some mix of language, physical appearance, and the ritual regulation of life, especially religion. What we typically think of as an active ethnic group is a grouping based on a thickened social categorization that is robustly important in a wide variety of social institutions and that has been transformed into a useful rule of thumb, heuristic, for evaluating and reacting to one's relationship to others in the social world. Overall, then, ethnic identity is just like any other set of identity dimensions, except that it involves traits commonly referred to as ethnic. Ethnicity is simply a certain kind of social radar. Okay. Section 6. What is special about ethnic categorizations? So, we should talk about what other cleavages exist in society, right? Some very famous political scientists from the 1950s and 60s called Lipset and Rokan based their careers on this idea of social cleavages. And there are many cleavages that we can consider, right? We have class. Class was very important, especially if you think about sort of Marxist analysis, right? You have religion, right? Obviously, there are cleavages in places like India that have major ethnic religions, not only between Muslims and Hindu, but also Sikhs and other very small religious organizations, Christians, etc. You have geography. So if you consider a state like Germany that was split until the fall of the Berlin Wall, the East sees the world very, very differently than the West, right? And you can see that in their most recent elections, where the AfD, a purportedly neo Nazi political party, uh, did exceptionally well in the East, whereas more centrist parties tended to do exceptionally well in the West. And the West tends to see the East as sort of backward and racist, and so you can have major geographical distinctions. Age is one. Obviously, there are major splits in thinking between, say, seniors and the youth in America and across the world. Gender, there are major differences in how women and men see the world. There are major splits in voting, definitely in the United States, when you look at gender. Men tend to, of course, vote Republican. Women tend to vote Democratic. And it seems the split is growing wider and wider election after election. So, why ethnicity, right? Why should we see and study societies through the lens of ethnicity? He says, well, first, there are just obvious barriers, right? There are communication barriers, right? And this can be either linguistic or cultural. It can be actual, literally different languages, or it can be different ways of speaking the same language, right? Where, say, the wealthy or a particular ethnic group have a very different patois from this ethnic group. And so if you think of a place like um, 19th century New Orleans, right? The whites versus the blacks versus the Creoles. Everyone was mostly speaking the same language, but there were very different patois that gave away your group membership, even if you couldn't literally be seen talking, right? Um, Furthermore, these tend to be immediately noticeable and are very relevant to the construction of the sort of rules of thumb or the heuristics involved in telling us about interactions with people. The second is just clearly like visible physical differences, right? There are ways, I wouldn't even say like this is a direct rule, but, there are tendencies, I guess, right? Between, say, certain regional variations between, say, Africans, where Northern Africans who tended to have evolved in desert situations look distinctly different from Southern Africans. Um, like there are also distinctions between Caucasian people, say Eastern European versus more Caucasian Jewish people, right? There are physical differences to be seen. There are obviously physical differences in things like skin tone, right? So these are just really easy cues for human mind to sort of latch on to make informational shortcuts. There's this sort of congruence with important exogenous factors like territory, right? Or class or labor specializations, right? So in India, if you're Muslim, often you're not allowed to work in certain sectors of the economy, right? Or say if you're one of the very low class ethnicities in your society, maybe you're not allowed to go into colleges or white um, what would you call it, white collar sort of work. If you look at the South in the United States, right, there were important labor distinctions and economic distinctions between white and black people. Black people could not sort of get into things like university, law school, government jobs, etc. Right, and so these exogenous factors can be highly correlated with ethnicity or race. There are also symbols and myths of common origin. This goes back to that famous 2000 piece by Smith. Uh, and here it says, excuse me, I'm sorry. It is highly plausible, then, that the invocation of symbols connoting kinship outside the family realm essentially reflects efforts to extend the meaning and especially obligations of family to new situations, larger contextual situations, warning people that their fate depends on the category in family like ways, right? So you'll be held to the same account that you would be inside of the family. Such symbolism gains plausibility and power when myths of common descent dominate. It also says that these symbols and myths of common origin also provide incentives for elites to invoke ethnic categories to camouflage or provide political cover for controversial actions, right? And we often see this in Asian, African, etc. sort of contexts. Finally, ethnic categorizations in places such as India are particularly likely to be invoked because they are highly situationally accessible and indeed often institutionalized by the state when it comes to things like caste or differences between Muslim and Hindu, etc., and often involve barriers to communication. Symbols powerfully connoting a sense of shared fate and readily observable markers that, for historical reasons, correspond plausibly to important political, economic, or social divides. So often the elites will sort of set these symbols onto political ideas, philosophies, economic ideas, etc., to sort of mix ethnicity with politics. All right. Section 7 is about implications for how, you know what, we're skipping section 7. We'll go finally to section 8 and just talk about sort of how this theory relates to the two former paradigms, primordialism and constructivism, right? So the new theory relates to both, and it says this is a nice mix, right? We can't see ethnicity and the ethnic world through the lens of either of these. We need to take a little bit from both. And he says the first sort of relation to primordialism is that people do have a deeply rooted psychological mechanism that facilitates social categorization, right? Like this is a pretty common human tendency. Second, there tends to be intrinsic value to those markers that we call ethnic in constituting the boundaries that distinguish these groups. And finally, some ethnic ID is in fact quite thick, old, stable, whatever you want to call it, right? It's hard to break out of feeling like a Muslim or a Protestant or say what would be a good term today? Oh, a Russian Ukrainian, right? Pretty strong ethnic bond. On the other hand, the new theory also relates to constructivism in first, the sense that group ID is not intrinsically linked to emotion, right? It's about history, it's about culture, it's about also informational shortcuts and reducing uncertainty. And finally, it's about what you can gain politically, economically, etc., from membership. Second, identity is constantly and inherently changing as the environment changes, right? Like we talked about, these don't have to be massive changes, but there are updates constantly. And sometimes there can be huge schisms and changes in your identity, wherein someone, say, changes from Christian to Muslim, or someone sort of slides between Tutsi and Hutu, right? Um, and then finally, identifications and the meanings associated with them are very highly manipulable by not only elites, but also by yourself, right? The person who is identifying as something. All right, that was a pretty long lecture. I really appreciate y'all sticking with me here. I will get the assignment up shortly. Have an incredible day, and I'll see you. I'll see you soon.